Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I hope you're going to get yourself a really refreshing drink, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. This is part 2 of our story, so if you haven't heard part 1, please go back on the description, because it's all about weaving a story together to make one lovely tale, and you don't want to miss any part of it. And let's get started with part 2 of our story. But my mother must have known that you had dismissed Seb, surely. So why would she let him into her cottage after knowing that Seb was involved in theft on your farm?
Your mother did not believe for a moment that Seb stole my saddle, or any of the other stuff that went missing from my farmhouse. She told me as much. She continued to employ Seb for jobs around her cottage. I know he was doing odd jobs for her, yard work and stuff like that. She gave me quite the mouthful for sacking Seb, I have to say. She wasn't best pleased with me.
You have no proof he stole your saddle, she said to me. Yet you sack him. Shame on you, Philip Barker. Perhaps you need to take a closer look at what's actually going on in front of your very eyes, she told me,
in no uncertain terms. She was most affronted I had sacked the young man. But I mean, what was I expected to do in the circumstances?
Well, you know, my mother was always inclined to believe the very best in people, give them the benefit of the doubt, so to speak. She stood by the age-old adage that you're innocent until proven guilty. She'd stick her neck out for the underdog, you know. But I hasten to say, she always was considered a good judge of character.
I think we can safely say that Alice might well have misjudged Seb Carpenter if he was involved in Alice's murder. It's a pity, really. On the surface he seemed like such a likeable fella. So much promise. I hasten to say he was always very articulate, extremely well-spoken and polite. But I suppose that doesn't mean a thing. Appearances can be very deceptive. Of course we don't know if he was involved, or if it was Seb that was invited for tea with your mother. But the table has been laid. There's a dry Victoria sponge here, a lemon meringue pie now teeming with ants. Alice was a very good woman, you know. So she laid 3 places, so there were 2 people she invited to tea. But whoever killed her, whether it was Seb or not, I don't think it was premeditated. And I certainly don't believe that Seb would set out to kill anyone intentionally. But let's just say he is volatile and explosive when things don't go his way. Well, I perceived that when I saw him pinning Eddie Freeman down in the horse stable. He looked irate, like he wanted to beat Eddie's lights out. Now, more to the point. Do you know if any of your mother's valuables are missing? Did she keep money here in the cottage? If stuff like that is gone, we can establish a clear motive for her death.
Mum, Granny always kept her money in the cookie jar on the refrigerator, but there's lots of money still in there, and her jewellery is still in her box. So if her attacker was after money, it doesn't make much sense, does it?
I think we need to call the police. They sure as hell need to question Seb. We will let them do all the investigation, tell them everything we know.
Seb's account. Growing up, I was a very troubled young man, predisposed to temper tantrums and angry outbursts. My grandmother described me as the spawn of the devil, which would make me so irate. If I was such a terrible person as she claimed, why did she not kick me out? She certainly allowed me to chop up firewood for her, clean up the yard, mow the grass for her, clean her entire house, wash the laundry as well as iron it, and help her prepare dinner. My grandmother always overlooked the good things I did for her, and looked at me contemptuously, as if she deemed me very privileged to breathe the very same air as she did. My grandmother had even warned Philip Barker not to dare hire me as a stable hand on his property. I was bad news in every way.
I told him he'd be an absolute fool to hire you, she told me proudly. I told him he would regret hiring the likes of you, that you can't be trusted, that you're a thief.
I remember feeling the fury bubbling up inside me, which I tried to restrain.
Why are you doing this to me, Granny? I need to make money. I need a job. But you're sabotaging all my chances of acquiring one. You tell anyone who might consider hiring me that I'm no good, that I'm dishonest. I think you do it on purpose, so I can become a full-time skivvy for you and wait on you hand and foot like Cinderella did for the ugly sisters."
My grandmother eyed me through her narrowed eyes very scathingly.
"You deserve all you get, Seb. You reap what you sow. That's what I say. Is it my fault you've been involved in petty theft before? Once a thief, always a thief. That's what I say. I'll tell you something for nothing, Seb. There is no lowlife in our society worse than a common thief. But, Grandma, I paid you all the money back that I owed you. And I've worked hard for you, doing jobs that many people pay good money for. I'm receiving counselling from the pastor to mend the error of my ways. I'm also dating his daughter. I would never do anything to upset Jeannie. She's my entire world. I'd do anything to make her happy. You know I would. And I have not stolen a thing in 2 entire years. People can change, Granny. I have changed. You know I have. The pastor believes in me. Why can't you? Tell yourself that as much as you like, Seb. But no, you will never, ever change. Look at your own mother. She was the scum of the earth. And you're following close behind her. When she was at school, she got arrested several times for shoplifting on numerous occasions. I've said this once, and I will say this again. The apple does not fall far from the tree. You're rotten to the core, Seb. I know that, and deep down you know that too. You complain about all the hard work I give you because you're a lazy bugger. That's exactly what you are. You should be very grateful that I've given you a roof over your head. Most would never have been so kind and selfless such as I have been. They'd have tossed you out with the ashes from the hearth, but not me. I'm a very good person, selflessly taking such great care of you. You would do well to remember that and show some gratitude and appreciation from time to time."
My grandmother would go bad-mouthing me around town to all who would listen. People paid attention to every word she said. I'd notice people when they saw me would deliberately cross the road to walk on the opposite side of the street. Mothers whispering to children and pointing at me as if I was the Grim Reaper himself, that their children should avoid at all costs. I could only imagine what they were actually saying. I knew that I had done bad things in my life. Of course I did. But I'd never ever hurt a single soul in my life, and never ever would. I'd been involved in petty theft. I had stolen from my grandmother, and I know that that is not excusable. But I had decided to change over a new leaf. I was visiting a pastor during the week for counselling, to help me go down the straight and narrow path to transform my life. I hasten to say I really was living my life honourably, no thanks to my grandmother, of course, who never saw any good in me at all. Pastor Allen believed that my troubled life began because my mother was an alcoholic. There were times she was so drunk that there was no food in our house, which is why I began to steal to fill up my hungry belly. I would steal burritos from the local store and pilferage in the bins outside the bakery, or see if the baker had thrown out some food past its sell-by date. I started stealing for survival, as it was very painful to go for 2 days without food. My pinching began with small things at first, and then I realized I could steal a radio and sell it for a substantial amount of money. So my stealing escalated. It meant I didn't have to rely on my mother anymore to buy me clothes or food, and so I provided independently for myself. And at 12 years old, I no longer went to bed with a growling stomach, thanks to my mother's drinking binges. I did try to get odd jobs from people for pocket money, of course, but those opportunities were few and far between. When my mother died from cirrhosis of the liver, my grandmother took me under her charge, very begrudgingly, I have to say. But I think when she saw that I had my uses, I did try to do odd jobs for people for pocket money, of course, but those opportunities were few and far between and relatively rare. When my mother died from cirrhosis of the liver, my grandmother took me under her charge, very begrudgingly. But I think when she realized I had my uses, she decided keeping me around indefinitely made her life infinitely easy. So she could indulge in a lot more laziness in her life, watching her favourite television programmes and knitting all day long, while I did all the work for her. My grandmother knitted socks and sweaters for charity, so that everybody thought she was a very good woman. But I knew well my grandmother had a dark, calculating side to her personality that she clandestinely hid from the world. People would tell her she was a saint for taking her troubled grandson on under her roof. Well, you know, I'm a godly woman. That's what I do because that's who I am. It was after one day, when I had a long, hard look at myself in the mirror, I realized I was responsible for my life, and if I continued down this downward spiral, I would ultimately end up in prison. I felt as if I was entangled in a lifestyle that was very hard to walk away from. I had grown up a thief. I didn't know how to live any differently. I decided I needed help, and Pastor Allen counselled me, telling me that I could choose to live a different life, but the ball was entirely in my court. When I started dating his beautiful daughter, Jeannie, I now had a positive incentive to reinvent myself. She told me quite plainly that our relationship would be over in a heartbeat if I ever put one foot into dirty water again, or went swimming with piranhas. I am not sure why Mr. Barker, against my grandmother's advice, decided to hire me as a farmhand at his stables. I remember he said to me, "Young man, your grandmother has strongly advised me against hiring you. She says you're no more than a common thief and a troublemaker. But I'm a firm believer in giving people the benefit of the doubt. Pastor Allen has got so many good things to say about you. I also believe in second chances. But any funny shenanigans, and I will ask you to leave my premises forthwith. Do you understand that?" I had nodded in agreement, and assured Mr. Barker that I would never ever let him down. "Now you and Eddie Friedman will be working together, mucking out stables, and attending to all the horses' needs. That includes washing them, grooming them, and so forth." Mr. Barker employed a farmhand who'd worked for him for 3 years. But I knew Eddie Freeman was bad news. Eddie came from a middle-class background. He'd been to good schools, and he was passionate about horses. It made sense he'd chosen to take on a job working with horses, but even a good bottle of milk can turn sour. I'd seen Eddie hanging around with unsavoury people that were heavily involved in drugs, and when I started to work at the Barker farm, Eddie saw his quintessential opportunity to steal liberally from Mr. Barker, so that if Mr. Barker discovered that things were going missing, the blame would ultimately be laid at my door. Given my past reputation, I mean, why would they believe in my innocence? A leopard does not change its spots, right? That is what most people would believe. It would seem that Eddie, who was running fast out of money, supporting his drug habit, was now choosing to steal from Mr. Barker. One day I saw him connivingly putting a very expensive leather saddle into the back of his truck and driving off with it. I knew he was stealing it. The next day I confronted him about his treachery. "You stole a saddle," I told him fiercely. "You bring it back, or I will tell Mr. Barker what you have done. You can't go stealing from your boss. Why are you being such a treacherous employee? Mr. Barker has been very good to you. He trusts you with his horses. You dishonour his trust like this. You're going down a very dangerous path, Eddie. I have to warn you. I've been down it myself, and I'll tell you this for nothing. It will ultimately destroy you." Eddie had smirked at me. "Oh, is that how you want to play it? Everyone knows in town you're nothing more than a common thief. So you think Mr. Barker is really going to believe you when you spin him a tall yarn? I'll tell him I saw you myself steal the saddle. Who do you think he's going to believe? Me or you? He ain't going to believe someone who has a reputation for thieving. And I've worked for him for 3 years and not lifted a thing from him." I knew he was right. I could shout on the rooftops, proclaim my innocence. But who would Mr. Barker believe? If I was in his shoes, I'd possibly not believe me either. I was livid with Eddie's despicable behaviour, that me and Eddie began to physically fight, and I launched a couple of punches at him. I was stronger than he was, so I managed to pin him down, but Mr. Barker saw me in a compromising position and thought I was a volatile person with an explosive temper, when nothing could be further from the truth. There was one very special person who always had faith in me, the old lady who I called Alice, who lived at Fairview Cottage, not far from the main Barker residence. That woman was like an angel in my life. She really was. When I told her that Mr. Barker had sacked me, she looked as mad as hell. "How dare he sack you, Seb? There is no way you stole that saddle from him. You might have done that in your past, but I know you've reformed your ways. You're a different young man these days."
"Well, can you blame Mr. Barker for thinking I'm responsible for the theft at the farm? Don't be too hard on him," I told her.
I shared the story with her about how Eddie Friedman was trying to pin the blame on me, and had told Mr. Barker that I had stolen his saddle, when I had seen him myself steal it with my own eyes. Alice told me she'd actually seen Eddie Friedman in town, smoking pot liberally with a couple of unsavoury-looking characters. He looked so spaced out. I'd like to give him a piece of my mind. He needs to own up to Mr. Barker for what he's done. Take responsibility for stealing that saddle. He's a scam artist, that's what he is, which is worse than a thief. How dare he put the blame at your door? That is a revolting thing for him to do. I feel most distressed about this. It's a cruel assassination on your reformed character. That's what it is. I had only ever done one thing to upset Alice, and that was asking her for early payment for her windows that I hadn't painted yet. I knew it was presumptuous of me to ask her for early payment, but I did have my good reasons. In the end, my girlfriend lent me the money so that I could buy Alice something special for her 82nd birthday. When I handed it over to her, she looked at me and said, "Seb, what on earth is this for?"
"Well, it's for you."
I handed it to her. She looked at me and said, "Seb, but what is this for?" "Why are you getting a present for me? I'm 82, not 80. 80's the special birthday." "You don't have to buy me anything. I don't want you spending your money on me. You can't afford to be splashing out."
"It's because, Alice, I really like you, and you're the one person who has always believed in me no matter what. You have no idea what that means to me, as no one else has had faith in me like you have."
"That's not true, Seb," she said, dabbing a couple of tears away from her eyes with a handkerchief. "If the pastor didn't have faith in you, he would not allow you to date his daughter Jeannie. I can assure you of that. I understand his brother is going to take you under his wing as an apprentice so that you can become a fully fledged carpenter."
"That's right. I'm going to marry Jeannie. I need to provide for her."
"You're a good boy, Seb. You really are. But the question is, what the hell is this present you've bought me?" she said, giving me a naughty wink. "The box is huge."
"Well, you've been mentioning to me that you like the tall scratching post at the pet shop in town, so I bought some materials to make you a personalised scratching post for socks. With a little creative ingenuity, if you like."
Alice unwrapped my present, that was the size of a small ladder, and gasped, "This is far superior to the one in town. You made this yourself, Seb. I'm gobsmacked. It's absolutely superb, so professional. I don't know what to say. You should take orders for these things. You'll make yourself an absolute fortune, you know."
"Well, I just hope Socks likes it," I laughed. "You're going to be a fine carpenter," said Alice approvingly. "You're already rather fantastic, so I don't know if you can improve on perfection. Now, I want you to come to tea on Tuesday afternoon at about 4:30. It's very important to me. I'm going to make my homemade lemonade, a Victoria sponge with cream, and, of course, my legendary lemon meringue pie. So I hope you're going to be coming, Seb."
"I wouldn't miss it for the world, Alice," I said, smiling at her warmly. I was very partial to her lemon meringue pie, but then again, who wasn't? I was very happy on Tuesday morning, as I had been blessed with excellent news. Alice had been to the pet shop in town on Monday morning to show off the cat scratching post I had made for her cat socks. They were so incredibly impressed by the quality of my work that they asked me to make over a dozen more scratching posts for them, and had assured me they would be purchasing still more, based on customer demand, of course. Alice had been so kind to do that, and now I had the opportunity for creating a little business sideline for myself. In my gratitude, I bought her a large bouquet of flowers as my way of saying thank you. When I arrived at Alice's cottage, She had dressed up very nicely for tea, in a pretty flowery dress, and was wearing her string of pearls like she always did.
"Oh, come in, Seth. It's so good to see you. Are those flowers for me?"
she asked, looking at the large bouquet of colourful flowers I presented her with.
"How many more presents are you going to give me, Seth? I'll start to be believing every single day of my life is a birthday." "They are indeed for you, Alice. Well, you went to the pet shop, didn't you, to show them the cat scratching post I made for you? Thanks to you, they've ordered a dozen more from me. Business is looking very promising."
"Oh, Seb, that's such wonderful news," said Alice. "I'm so pleased for you." She beckoned me into the cottage and busied herself arranging the flowers I'd brought her in a large crystal vase, which she placed on the table. "I have to say they were very impressed with your cat scratching post, Seb. You made for Socks, who incidentally, I have to tell you, loves the thing. Last night he wouldn't stop scratching at it. Mr. Bozeman told me that your scratching post is far superior to anything else he's ever sold in his business. So you should be very proud of yourself, Seb." I glanced briefly at the table and pointed out to Alice that she'd laid 3 places for tea, not 2.
"Is someone else coming to tea?"
I asked her, but before she could answer me, there was a loud rapping sound at the front door. Alice trotted over to the door, and who should be standing there in the entrance but my enemy, Eddie Freeman. Why on earth had Alice invited around the young man who had deliberately got me fired? I hardly had anything nice to say to someone who had thrown me under the bus and had wilfully lied about me to the boss to cover up their own duplicity. I think Eddie was as bewildered to see me as I was to see him. In the past, Alice had invited him around for tea, and he was very partial to her lemon meringue pie, which was legendary in these parts, but I'm quite sure he was not at all pleased to be in my presence. Alice beckoned for us to both sit down at the table. She brought out a large pot of tea. Her hands were shaking precariously, as she had quite arthritic fingers. She put the pot down very carefully on the table, then lifted it up slowly in her wobbling hands, and began to pour the piping hot tea into fragile bone china teacups. She then began to pile our plates with lemon meringue pie and Victoria sponge cake, seeping with jam and cream. I'd been looking forward to the lemon meringue pie all day, but being in Eddie's presence meant that Alice's pie lost its appeal. How I wished she hadn't invited around this cockroach.
"Now you're probably wondering why I invited the both of you to tea. I invited you to be together because I don't like disputes of any kind. In fact, I loathe them. I was hoping the 2 of you could make up. But first things first. I think that, Eddie, you owe Seb a very big apology for what you did. I also believe you need to go and visit Mr. Barker and tell him the truth. You must confess to stealing the saddle and the other things you've taken from his abode. It's the right thing to do. You can't go souring a man's reputation so indiscriminately like you have. It's a very unkind thing for you to do."
Eddie was chewing his lemon meringue pie, and he looked affronted.
"Look, Alice, I don't know what tall stories that Seb here has been feeding you, but if you're talking about him getting sacked by Mr. Barker, he brought this entirely on himself. I had to tell my employer he stole the saddle. I mean, Mr. Barker needs to be informed about these things. If he has a dishonest farmhand working for him, he needs to be aware of this. I was being responsible and very loyal." "Why are you lying, Eddie? It is most unbecoming, I have to say. I know Seb did not steal the saddle, and you know too. You were the one that got him sacked. You pinned the blame on him, didn't you, so you could support your drug habit? I know all about it, Eddie. I've seen you in town and what you get up to there. Now, you've been hanging around with some very unsavoury characters. You knew that Seb here has changed, but because of his record of theft from the past, people would naturally believe that Seb was responsible for pilfering. What have you got to say for yourself, young man?" That was when the tea party came crashing to an end, and in a moment of infuriated rage, Eddie got up grabbed the large crystal glass vase of flowers on the side table, and he hit Alice hard on the head with it. Alice fell backwards onto the floor. I knew at once she was dead, when a huge pool of blood poured out of her head. She lay there lifeless and limp, her eyes staring vacantly into space like a dead fish. "What the hell have you done to Alice? She's dead! Look what you've done!" Eddie almost looked triumphant. He didn't appear to even care about what he'd done. "Now she can't go blabbing to Mr. Barker about me, like a tell-tale tit. I am sure the police will be very interested in questioning you about Alice's death," he said, grinning at me. "I'll tell them you hit Alice over the head with a vase because you wanted money. I'm sure they'll believe me over you any day of the week because of your lousy reputation. They won't believe a single word you say. It's my word against yours." "You have killed Alice, Eddie. What the hell have you done? She's innocent. She's a defenseless old woman in her 80s. Look at you. You have no remorse, no shame. You don't even care that you've killed her, do you?" "She's a blabbermouth. That's what she is," said Eddie, nonchalantly. "She needed to be silenced." I could feel the anger welling up in my chest, especially with Eddie's indifference over Alice's demise, and his willingness to throw me under the bus and pretend I was responsible for her death. "I'm going to kill you, Eddie," I growled. "You won't get away with this. You won't." Eddie knew I meant what I said, that I was not toying with him like a cat with a mouse. So he hightailed it out of Alice's cottage, opening her front door and just darting outside. He hesitated for a brief moment, as if deciding where to run, and then went racing through the woodgrove that framed the rear of Alice's property, with me pursuing him with an ardent determination. "I'm going to kill you," I growled under my breath. "See if I don't." I was stronger than he, and far more powerful. I think Eddie knew in the woodgrove he might find somewhere to hide out, whereas if I chased him in the meadow, I could have caught up with him quickly. But the woodgrove was an obstacle course, with gnarled roots angrily jutting out of the precipitous, uneven, treacherous ground, like unseen, bony tentacles determined to ensnare you. I hasten to say there was a selection of paths through the trees that were like a never-ending maze, and beyond that were many places to hide, trees, foliage, and plenty of verdant brush. It was late in the day, so the shimmering pearly light of the fading noonday sun danced gallantly through the trees, bespeckling the forest floor in a soft, ethereal resplendence. A pleasant light breeze was blowing, so that the leaves of the lofty trees rustled as they swayed their branches quite vigorously. The birds tweeted and trilled in the canopy above our heads. "I'm going to get you, Eddie, and when I do, I'm going to kill you," I screamed out after him. My breathless words could be clearly heard. "You killed Alice! I can't let you get away with this!" I staggered down the earthen trail with an awkward gait. I navigated my way across an uneven obstacle course, where branches and logs lay haphazardly across the earthen floor, and obtrusive trees with scratchy branches brushed against me, sometimes ripping my shirt with their thorns. I stepped up my speed, blowing caution to the wind, and galloped towards Eddie. I gained on him steadily. I was relatively fit, certainly much fitter than he was. I lunged towards him, and with one hand I pulled him on the ground. Eddie fell backwards, and I straddled him. I had subdued him under my weight, and was about to punch him in the chest, when the forest suddenly seemed to boom, like a heavy drum. The only way I can describe it from a distance is I could hear something very angrily thundering towards us, something powerful and treacherously dangerous. I instinctively knew this, and so did Eddie. I forgot about punching Eddie, and he forgot all about me, as terror and a feeling of impending dread overtook the both of us. I think in that poignant moment we knew that we were in danger, and that it was trumpeting towards us like a charging elephant in musk. The forest became so quiet and subdued. Even the leaves of the trees stopped rustling. The breeze died down. The birds' song dissipated, and the silence was deafening. The bitter taste of bile rose up in the back of my tongue, and I knew that I was in imminent danger. I could taste it like a snake. At this point, Eddie had prized himself back onto his feet. His face was pale like a ghost, his eyes round with terror. "Something's coming! Something big! Oh my God!" You would have thought our instincts would be to run. Isn't that what you do when a predator is in your midst? I've seen it so often on wildlife documentaries. I thought it was an instinctive inbuilt mechanism in the all of us, like when a deer bolts away as fast as they can from a cheetah or a lion. But the instinct to run did not seize either one of us. We both stood in the woodgrove, our bodies completely paralysed with terror, our knees buckling beneath us like unsteady camping chairs. I hasten to say, in that moment my bladder burst open, and I wet myself. In the next second the booming sound got closer and closer and closer. The ground heaved, vibrated, moaned. Branches broke and snapped. Heavy feet pounded the ground. At first I saw a dark silhouette, an obscure, tenebrific, ambiguous shape. And then the black blur bolted towards us, standing only 4 feet away from us, his body shaking with furious indignation. He was pounding his heavy chest. For a moment I thought I was locked up in a dream. Everything was so surreal. This angry creature was a powerful male Bigfoot. I was in no doubt about that. In that moment I saw my death in vivid colour before me, and incredible detail. I knew my life was extinguished. I didn't have a fighting chance to overcome this powerful, imposing, lofty creature. In his eyes, I was a fragile porcelain doll. Every part of me was screaming, "Run! Run! Run!" But I continued to stand there like a lemon. The Bigfoot roared so loudly that the entire woodgrove seemed to wobble and tremble under the gargantuan echo of his voice. "Ah! Ah!" His dark, soulless eyes were filled with a venomous hatred. He spat on the ground at us in disgust, like someone chewing tobacco. He glared at us maliciously, exposing a mouthful of his large incisors, and growled like a lion. He looked at me and Eddie with a predatory, "I want to kill you" look. And in that moment, I knew that I needed to run, even if death was inevitable. It was my only fighting chance, my only hope. And the adrenaline came. "Run!" I screamed to Eddie. "He's going to kill us!" And we both ran and ran. And the adrenaline helped me to run, even faster than I imagined I could. But the creature grabbed Eddie, and I continued to run, without daring to look back. I could hear Eddie's fitful screams, his desperate yells. And then there was a very uncomfortable silence. I knew Eddie was dead, but I ran out of that woodgrove as fast as I could, with a large black figure looming behind me. Even now, I don't know how I managed to escape him, but I ran past Alice's house and jumped into my grandmother's car, which thankfully was not locked, and the keys were on the seat, something I never really did normally. My fingers trembled as I put the key in the ignition. The car wobbled and stalled, but I put my foot on the accelerator and began to drive away as fast as I could. My heart thundered in my chest so loudly, I was surprised it didn't just burst out. Sweat was pouring down my back until my clothes were utterly drenched. Every part of me began to shudder and shake, and in my rear-view mirror I saw the Bigfoot watching me, very angrily oscillating his arms above his head. It seemed like he was punching the air defiantly around him, as if he was mad as hell that I'd got away. He began to give me chase, and for a while was running steadily by the side of my truck, punching the air with his fists and showing off his large teeth in a vindictive, malevolent smile. His deep, evil eyes bored into mine like a jackhammer, which sent the fear of God into every single cell in my body. I do not mind admitting that tears spilled down my cheeks. I tasted their salt on my tongue. I hit my foot down on the gas so hard and zoomed past him. Needless to say, I'm glad I returned home in one piece, my energy completely drained, my soul defeated by a senseless hopelessness concerning the events of what I would always describe
as the most horrifying day of my entire life. The hostile Bigfoot I'd encountered seemed like a crazy, idiosyncratic nightmare from which I would surely awaken. But this was no dream. Alice was dead. So was Eddie, the man who had killed her. I locked myself in my bedroom when I got home, something I've never done before. My grandmother pounded angrily at my door, bickering and complaining because I didn't respond to her. Instead, I slipped into a deep sleep, my body seeking recovery and regeneration from its horrific trauma. In the background, I could hear her spilling out her hatred towards me. But after that Bigfoot, she didn't intimidate me in the slightest, and I ignored her as I slept. "Seb! Open up, Seb! Open up at once! Open up! You've got chores to do! Why aren't you helping me with them?" I could hear her moaning and groaning, but in the shock of my fear, I said nothing, and finally she left me alone. I hasten to say the police only interviewed me after I had some trauma counselling. They knew Seb had been responsible for killing Alice, as his fingerprints were on the crystal vase, and they incriminated him. I told them my story. I was informed not to speak about the Bigfoot I'd encountered to anyone, or else there would be hell to pay. I was warned to keep my trap shut, in no uncertain terms, by several visitors who came to see me in person. I was told Eddie's body had been recovered, but apparently something had stamped on him so hard that he looked like an insect that had been squashed. I know the police believed my story, only because a body has never looked like a squash insect before, so whoever killed Eddie had to be a hell of a strong, like that Bigfoot was. I do know the army was sent in to search for the Bigfoot, but I have no idea whether they were actually able to kill him or not. What I do know, however, was I was warned not to say a single thing, but I did share my part of the story with Carly and her daughter, as they were related to my good friend Alice, and I believed they deserved to know the story. "Well," Carly said to me, "justice was served in the end. The man that killed my mother is no longer around, but I have to say I wouldn't wish his violent death on anyone. It wasn't a pleasant way to go. I know if the Bigfoot had not killed Eddie, I would probably have killed him myself, and I admitted as much to the police, but they weren't very bothered about that. They seemed to understand my anger. I hasten to say I've never seen a more dreadful creature in my entire life than the Bigfoot I encountered. I think, in truth, I'd rather encounter a lion in Africa, or a rhino, even a hippopotamus, than him any day of the week. I still believe it's a miracle I lived through that ordeal. You'll be glad to know I married Jeannie. I work as a carpenter, and I've never broken the law since. I hasten to say, rather like a reformed smoker that hates anyone who smokes, I loathe theft of any kind. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.